Okay, so we're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. Thanks to Matt for taking over the class last week. As we've been going through Daniel, we started out by looking at God's role in kingdoms, and in particular looking at the eternal kingdom of the church and how it would come about. And so you have all of these seemingly eternal kingdoms because they're so powerful. I mean, I think when Babylon came along, everybody said, wow, how could they ever be destroyed? When Rome came along, everybody said, wow, how could they ever be destroyed? And of course, neither Babylon nor Rome are here anymore. So one of the things we spent a lot of time in, looked at probably 3-4 classes, was just simply how God works in kingdoms, how He is in charge. Every one of them, their timeline and their history is in His hands. Of course, that comes across in the New Testament as well. We have the teaching that every authority is there because God puts it there, and He can remove it as well. Then from there we looked at the individual acts of faithfulness that you can see Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego doing in the midst of a pagan nation, living counterculturally. The culture of Babylon was idolatrous. They had no respect whatsoever for Jehovah. And in fact, Habakkuk refers to them and says their God is their strength. They had various gods. In fact, the main person that we're going to look at, the king Belshazzar, his name comes from their gods. Bel, meaning lords or kings or master. His name actually means protect the king. Bel will protect the king. So they had all these different gods, but ultimately their real God was their own strength. That was what Habakkuk tells us. And how do people live righteously in a nation that is so unrighteous and opposed to the lifestyle of those who would put their faith in Jehovah? So we looked at Daniel in the lion's den. We looked at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We looked at Daniel's prayer. Now, last week, Matt looked at the humbling of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, when he walks out on that balcony and looks around and says, look at this nation that I've built, and how even though that would seem reasonable to a guy like Nebuchadnezzar, because he looks at it and he says, look, I fought the battles. I commissioned the contractors to build the hanging gardens. I did all these things. The truth is, all of that happened because God allowed it to. And so God gives and God takes away. And so there was that humbling of Nebuchadnezzar to the point where the scriptures leave open-ended whether or not Nebuchadnezzar even may have, at the end of his life, they're converted. I mean, it doesn't ever specifically tell us one way or the other, but there's a lot of indication that Nebuchadnezzar may very well have finally, after being humbled to the point of eating grass like a beast of the field, recognized that God is the one and only true God in a way that previously he hadn't. If that is the case, that would match in a lot of ways why he would be considered the head of gold in that imagery of the statue, because even though Babylon was an idolatrous nation, if they had a king who at some point truly dedicated himself to Jehovah, that would be a whole lot better than everybody else. But that humbling was what we looked at last week. Now in Daniel chapter 5, we're going to look at another example of God humbling and removing people from power when and how He wants, and how the excess and selfish pagan living finally does catch up with both rulers and nations. Because Daniel chapter 5 is about Belshazzar and his fall, but it's not just about his fall independently, but the fact that he's the end of that Babylonian era, and that nation is going to be handed over to the Medes and the Persians. And so as we look at him, what we're seeing is how whenever somebody says, I'm in control and I can do as I please, they are never more than a hair's breadth away from God saying, no, you can't. I can just take it away just like that. In fact, there's a phrase that we use quite often when something is imminently going to happen, which is the writing's on the wall. Right? You've probably heard somebody use that saying, the writing's on the wall. Well, this is where that comes from. It's from Daniel chapter 5 and the writing of the wall of the end of the Babylonian era and the end of the reign of King Belshazzar. So, Daniel chapter 5 begins with Belshazzar feasting. Now, Belshazzar is and we talked about this a little bit earlier in the class when we were going through some of the history and archaeology bits. The actual king at this time is his dad, Nabonidus. He's the last recorded king, but the history also tells us Nabonidus was a bit of a recluse, and he went off on his own to the city of Teman and lived there and left the day-to-day running of the nation and the city to his son Belshazzar. So at a certain point in this account, Belshazzar will take Daniel and he'll raise him to be the third most powerful man in the nation. And for a long time they wonder, why the third? You know, here Daniel has done this great thing for Belshazzar and he raised him to be the third most powerful man. You would kind of assume what he would do is raise him to be the second most powerful guy. Well, history tells us the reason why is Belshazzar was the second most powerful guy. His dad Nabonidus was number one. He's number two, so he's going to offer to raise Daniel to the third greatest position. But in Daniel chapter 5, it begins with him holding a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the thousands. There is quite a lot of historical backing for the fact that this was probably the dedication of his palace. Without getting into too much of the boring things about textual criticism and things like that, in the Masoretic text it actually refers to the idea that this feast was at the dedication of his palace. So I think maybe if you read a King James Version, it might even mention that. We don't know it for sure, but it would actually match a lot of some of the other things that we're going to read, that this massive gathering of people was a dedication type of event. It wasn't just an everyday party. It likely had to do with Belshazzar kind of re-emphasizing how great a guy he is and how much power he has, which matches the storyline, right? Because the storyline is Belshazzar saying he's so great I can do whatever he wants. I can do whatever I want, but what's God going to tell him? No, you can't. You can't do whatever you want. And you're not as important as what you think you are. So he gathers this massive gathering of people and nobility, and it will mention multiple times throughout the account and emphasize that what Belshazzar is doing during this is he's drinking wine. And it will mention that over and over and over again, that he's drinking, and this happened as he was drinking. So what might the implication be there? He's getting drunk, right? This is that kind of a party, right? And throughout history, we've seen lots of examples where people have gotten themselves into a lot of trouble with drinking parties. And the New Testament specifically condemns drinking parties. But if you read over in Proverbs 31 specifically, when speaking about kings, makes the statement that it is not good for a king to do what? Get drunk. It's not good for a king to drink wine. In fact, in Proverbs 31 it says, leave the drinking for the dying man. If a guy's dying, right, give him the morphine then. But a king is ruling. He's got to have a head clear. He's got to be thinking. He's got to be sober-minded. And this is the opposite of that. So he's gathered all these people. He's drinking the wine. And the effects of that alcohol seem to be at least part of what's being emphasized here, that he's making choices without a sober mind. And I might mention that unlike what we see in today's culture, which would say, look, he was drunk when he did that, and when normally they'll follow up with, he was drunk when he did that, what are we normally going to follow up with? He's not responsible. There's some sort of excuse, right? If he'd been sober, he wouldn't have done that, and we use that to get ourselves off the hook. I didn't know what I was saying. I'd had a few too many. That's not going to work with Belshazzar, which tells us God holds you accountable for your behavior, even if your behavior is something that came out of you making some poor previous choices, right? And oftentimes in life, that's exactly how it works. You make some bad choices earlier on, and you didn't expect these long-term effects of it. You thought, well, it's just a small thing, but it ends up having a bigger compounding effect down the road. Nick talked about that when he preached, that those little things that you do can really set the course of things. And so that's it doesn't let you off the hook of responsibility. So as he's drinking, Belshazzar tastes the wine, and he gives orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So when he refers to taking these gold and silver vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had got from the temple, what was the original purpose for those gold and silver vessels? What? Yeah, they were to honor God, right? They were either specifically vessels that were used by the priests in worship, or they had been things that had been dedicated in the storehouses to God. So they bring all of these things out, and then he uses them as common drinking elements. So this is in place of the party silverware. And it specifically mentions that as they're doing this, who do they praise? Their idols, yeah. The gods of silver and gold and wood and stone, right? Now, what we're going to see is, as we go through and look at the whole picture of this story with Belshazzar, is he's giving praise to not only idols, but to the gods of dead things, right? Non-living things, silver, gold, wood, stone, iron. And what he's going to be confronted by is the God of life and breath. And that's put as a contrast in this story, that you have the gods that are dead, and by dead meaning they never were alive at all, they're non-living. And then you have the one God that not only is alive, but he's the one who gives us life. And when he's confronted with that God, when Belshazzar has to face that, you're going to see his life start to crumble. He starts to shake in his boots. He loses all that bravery. He is afraid for his life. And it's reminiscent of the sorts of things you would see like in Isaiah. Isaiah is very fond of pointing out the foolishness of worshiping a god of wood. He uses the whole analogy of a guy goes out in the forest and he cuts down a tree and takes half the tree and he cuts it for firewood, and the other half he makes into a god and he bows down to it and says, "Oh, praise you, God of the forest." And how ridiculous is that? And so that connection is made as you progress through this. And as he's there's really three different things that we see combining together. Now, if you see a fourth, you let me know. But the three that I see here are, you have insobriety, you got that drunkenness, you have excess, right? We're going to have this massive party. Historically speaking, this is also at a time when Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians are on the climb. They're on their way, and they're a known force in the world. Babylon is not as great as it once was. It's on the decline, and their enemies are getting stronger. And what's he doing? He's partying. That's excess. That's not being sober-minded. It's not showing self-control. We saw that even during the pandemic, where you would hear these accounts of rulers who were governors and whatnot. They were telling people how they had to be careful, and then what did you find those governors themselves doing? Yeah, eating at fancy restaurants, right? Yeah, the California governor was the one that came to my mind too. And it's just like the inconsistency there, right? And then the last one is that idolatry, because it specifically says that they're praising those gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron. So all of that comes into play. And if you think about that in comparison to what Peter says in the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 4, the time already is past. Past is sufficient for you to have carried out the desire of the Gentiles. And remember, the word Gentiles just means nations. So when Peter's saying this, he says to Christians, the time for you as Christians has already come by, and it's been sufficient for you to live like all the other nations, like other people, having pursued a course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. What you read in 1 Peter 4:3 is everything that we're supposed to not do anymore, and Belshazzar is doing. That sensuality is just following your senses. Whatever you want, you take. The lust, the drunkenness, the carousing. Here he is, this big party with all the nobles, and he has all his wives and all his concubines, and it's a drinking party, and there's all this idolatry. So 1 Peter 4:3 is everything Belshazzar is doing and everything we're told not to do. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned, Belshazzar's name means Bel will. You may remember I said it earlier. Yeah, will protect the king. That's ironic, isn't it? Because Bel means the lords or the masters, it's the false gods. And that ain't going to happen. That's the whole point of this, is this guy's name is, I'm safe because my gods will keep me safe. That's literally what his name means, and it's not true at all. There's an irony to that idea. And so he's there doing that, and this fingers of a man's hand emerge and begin writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. So there's several different things that are really interesting about this. One, what we see is that the king saw, and it says the king saw the back of the hand. My version says back of the hand. Some versions say hollow of the hand. We're not, the tricky part about the Aramaic there is it's hard to tell exactly what is meant. It could literally be the exact opposite. It could be this part of your hand or this part of the hand. But the point is that he looks, and he, in the middle of this party, just sees a disembodied hand. He can't see who's connected to it. Some of the more literal translations will talk about the finger joints. So you're not even sure how much of the hand he's seeing. Just enough to really creep you out. That's what he sees, right? He sees enough to really be upset by it. And also, kind of in your mind's eye, I want you to imagine this feast, and they don't have electricity. So it's not like what we have here, where you turn the lights on really bright and you can see everything really well. More likely, they have lampstands all over the place. Now, this lampstand that is near where the hand is the lampstand. Now, what lampstand is that? It's from the temple. Yeah, so that we have the temple lampstand, most likely is where the hand is by. But in this giant party, there's probably lamps all over. So you have bright spots and dark spots all throughout. And so he looks and sees this hand writing on the wall, and it's right by the lampstand. And that's mentioned specifically that it's there. And I think there's a contrast being made. In the temple, the lampstand, if you were to go into Solomon's temple, there was only one source of light inside that temple, and it was a lampstand. It was the only source of light in there. Otherwise, if that thing wasn't lit, you couldn't see. And it was supposed to be lit perpetually, right? It was always supposed to be burning. And then you think about other things in the New Testament and Old Testament. Old Testament, thy word is a lamp unto my feet, right? We know that Solomon's temple, that the temple that was built, whether you're talking about the Mosaic tabernacle or the Solomonic one, it's symbolic of things of a greater value, right? It's a shadow of things to come, is the way Hebrews puts it. That lampstand, I think, is representative. It's of this idea of being lit by God. It's the only source of light. And we think about God as light and His Word as a lamp and all these sorts of things. So the lampstand is this picture of God illuminating things. Well, this hand is writing on the wall right over by that lampstand that is supposed to represent God's light to His people. And what's actually happening is the opposite, isn't it? This is a party of darkness. It's a party of lewdness and carousing and idolatry and wickedness. And yet over by this lampstand that's being treated like another lampstand in the party, this disembodied hand begins to write on the plaster. Okay, so anybody have anything there? There's a couple of more interesting things I want to point out, but I don't want to get too far afield in case somebody has something to say or something that they caught in the text that they want to bring out. Okay, so if this party is for the dedication of a palace, which, as I said, there's a lot of historical evidence that is the case. The people who are really smart and study this stuff and study the text say that's the type of party probably going on. If it's at the dedication of a palace, here's how it worked in Babylon. When a king became king, he'd build a palace. And on the walls were empty plaster. And then as his kingdom grew, and as he had victories, they would document those victories on the plaster of the palace walls. Now, it does not say it in the text, so I don't want you to go home and say, Scott said it isn't for sure, but it is an interesting detail to think about. That if this palace is that for Belshazzar, on the walls right now are nothing. He's a new king. He's getting ready to document all of his victories. But instead, who writes on the wall first? God does. God writes on the wall, and He's going to tell him, I'm in charge of whether you have any victories or none at all. And so I think if you are looking at an Eastern mind, this is one of the problems for us, is we're Western people thinking in reading a book written by Eastern people and an Eastern culture. These things stand out more to them than it does to us. We don't live in an era of kings and conquering and victories and stuff like that. But, even go back to ancient Rome. You have a Roman emperor. He becomes emperor, and he builds monuments to himself and documents all of his victories. They did the same thing back then. So here, this hand begins to write on the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. Like I said, I mentioned that because it specifically mentions the plaster, which is one of those details you go, well, why would we care? That may be the reason why we would care. And so the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing, and the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. I'm reading out of the New American Standard. I think if you go back and look at the King James Version, it'll talk about him being alarmed, and it'll say that his his loins became loose, which is a disturbing mental picture. But the reason I bring that up is when you hear in the Bible the word loins, normally there's a verb attached with it. It's gird your loins, right? What does it mean to gird your loins? Yeah. What? Yeah, pull it together. Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Gwen, for saying that in a very tactful way. Pull it together. You know, you're going to take your belt, you're going to put it on, you're going to get ready for action. This is the opposite. He went from being the king in charge to now loosened loins. His hip joints become loose. He's nervous, he's afraid, he's alarmed, his face grows pale. He goes from the guy who the party is for him and I'm the king and I'm going to do what I want to now all of a sudden all of that goes away immediately. You ever have one of those moments in your life where you had it all figured out and then all of a sudden you didn't have it figured out? I can think about that with some car accidents that have happened. You know, you're driving along and everything seems fine. I'm totally in control. And then somebody comes out of nowhere and you either have a near accident or an actual accident and you realize how far are you away from death at any moment? This close. This is that kind of a moment for him. So his knees begin to knock together. And so then he gathers together all of the wisest people that he can imagine to gather together to find the interpretation to this thing. Now, it doesn't tell you up front what it is that is written down, but later on as we progress in the text, we find that it's 4 words. Many, tekel, upharsin. And all of these people try and interpret it, and they don't know what to say. Now, it's possible they couldn't read it. That's, one of the things out there is that, well, maybe they weren't able to even read it. I don't think that that's the case. I think that everybody could read it. But the words there, mene is like a mina, it's a small coin. And tekel is the same, it's an Aramaic word for shekel, which is a larger coin. And upharsin is a word for like a half mina or a half shekel. So it would be like seeing on a wall where it said penny, penny, quarter, half dollar. So a disembodied hand writes on the wall, penny, penny, quarter, half dollar. Somebody interpret that for me. You see the problem? It's like it doesn't make any sense. It could mean a lot of different things. And if you are all of these different conjurers and servants of the king, the Chaldean diviners, the only news you want to give the king is you want to make sure you're right so you don't get yourself in trouble because the king's obviously worked up. And you want to give him good news. And so if in doubt, you keep your mouth shut and wait for somebody else to do it. It's like when they say whoever wants to volunteer step forward and everybody else just steps back, right? That's what they're all doing. So they have no answer to this, and he is greatly alarmed. We'll say that down in verse 9. He was greatly alarmed, and his face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. And then the queen comes in. This is quite likely the queen mother, that she's because she would still retain that title of queen. So this would be Nabonidus' wife. And she has an awareness of somebody who can help. She knows about Daniel. And as she describes Daniel, look at the language in verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. So one, does she really understand Daniel? No, spirit of the holy gods. She's still thinking idolatrous, right? But she knows this guy has a spirit unlike other people, which if you remember some of the other places where we've read about Daniel, that's mentioned in his character all the time, this man with an extraordinary spirit. I love that language with Daniel because what it tells us is people who don't even understand God and why Daniel's doing what he's doing understand there's something different about him. I think that's exactly what we should be shooting for in our life. Not everybody's going to understand your faith. But we want them to see there's something different about us. And then if they start asking, then we can say, well, I can tell you why. It's because of Jesus. So she says, there's a man in the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So she gives advice. I know who you need. You need Daniel. He's done this before. He did it for Nebuchadnezzar. And when he refers to Nebuchadnezzar as your father, we're not talking about biological, but we're talking about just in terms of the hierarchy of kingship. But here, one of the things that he says about him is he is an explainer of enigmas and solver of difficult problems. The literal interpretation of that is a dissolver of doubts, which I just think is a cool word picture. I love word pictures like that. Daniel has put his faith in God, and Daniel is living a life without doubt. And those around him that he interacts with, he dissolves their doubt too. Right? He's known as a guy who can fix problems. He's a guy who can help. When we turn to the New Testament, you think about Jesus talking about being servants. I mean, isn't that how Daniel's being described here? He's a guy who can help. He's a guy with that mentality. So here he is, and they're going to summon Daniel. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Anything there? Okay, so then you have Daniel. He's going to come to interpret this, and he's going to offer, Belshazzar is going to offer to give him all sorts of wealth. And in verse 17, Daniel answered, he said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. So one, Daniel makes it clear, I will help, but I'm not helping because of the money. And there's a couple of different ways you could take that. One, I think it's probably fair to say with Daniel, he's going to help because it's the right thing to do. Daniel is just a man of faith, and he's going to serve God. But what might be another reason that he says, keep your gifts? That's right. That's the other bit, right? Keep your gifts. You're going to elevate me, and you're just going to be gone. So what does it even matter, right? I'm about to tell you, you have a nothing. That's another piece of it there that may play into the storyline as well. But he will get to these, the many tekel upharsin, and he will interpret them, and each of those words also has a verb idea to it. The mene, which is the mine of that small coin, so the penny, right? It also means numbered. If you were to use it as a verb, it means numbered. And so he says, this is the interpretation of the message. Go down to verse 26. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. In the New Testament, Paul will say that God knows the boundaries of your habitation when speaking about individuals. So for a long time, Jenna used to like to tell people, she goes, God knows I'm never going to cross the Mississippi. God knew differently. But she used to joke about that she just thought she was just somebody that God had kind of made that was never going to travel much and never go far in her life. She goes to show you we don't know nothing. But God knows the boundaries of your habitation. He knows exactly how far you're going to travel, how long you're going to live, all those sorts of things. That's in His hand at an individual level. But here, it said it's known at a kingdom level too. He's numbered your kingdom, and He knows how long it's going to last, and He's put an end to it. So we wonder at times, how long will America be around? Guess who never wonders? He knows, doesn't He? He knows exactly. Like, that's not a question in his mind. He knows exactly how this works. So you and I don't need to know. We just need to know him who knows. So that's the first one. And now you might notice with the many, it's mentioned twice. We don't know exactly why it's mentioned twice versus the other words, tekel and upharsin, that are only mentioned once. But one likely possibility, why would you say something twice? Yeah, just emphasis, right. Yeah, we're just saying it's numbered and it's ending. And in case you missed it, it's numbered and it's ending. So have your party and enjoy it because it's about over. Then the next word is tekel, and that's that word for shekel. So it's a larger weight, like I say, like quarter. But it also means weigh. And so you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. So now here's the second piece of that puzzle. God does the numbering and he counts the days and he says this is how long a nation will last. But how does he make that counting? What does he use to make that decision of how long a nation will last? What's the whole point of the tekel? When he says, you've been weighed and found wanting. Wanting in what? Yeah. Quality, what? Yeah, value or worth. You don't have the characteristics that God finds valuable anymore. You just aren't worth keeping around. And we can see that with Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember with Abraham? And Abraham has that conversation with God. How long? He's sending these angels and he's going to figure out how many righteous people are in the city. And Abraham has this conversation, well, God, what if there's just a few left? And God says, okay, for that many I'll keep it, for this many I'll keep it. But then it got down to a point where even Abraham had to agree, it just ain't worth keeping around. Right? The quality's gone. So God does number the days of kingdoms, but he numbers it based off of their quality. And one of the things that we're told is, you can have some say-so in the quality, right? We don't live in a world without free will. If there was no free will, then it's just set, and it is what it is. But we know that you do have free will, and we know of cases of national repentance. Can anybody think of an example in the Bible of national repentance that God recognized? Nineveh, right? That's the first one that pops to almost everybody's mind. Nineveh. And they were really bad. In fact, they eventually become the capital of Assyria, and they're really, really bad, and God will wipe them out. But when they repented, had that national repentance, God weighed them and found that quality still there, and so he extended the number of their days. In the same way that we see God doing that with like Hezekiah as an individual. He gave him more time. So God knows the number, but God also says, I'm willing to change that number based upon the quality of character of a nation. And when you look at nations, I think we have to look at it, Homer Haley had the saying that national sin requires national repentance. I don't know if he coined that or he's just the guy I heard it from, but I think that's a fair way to put it. You can have faithful people in a nation, but it be at a point where there's just not enough of that. And so God weighs them and finds them wanting. Because after all, in the nation at this time, there is Daniel, right? But God's not going to keep them around just for Daniel. And then the last one, upharsin, Paris, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. That half shekel, half mina, it's the idea of division. And he says, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to divvy it up and take what you have, and I'm going to give it to the Medes and the Persians instead. And for God, it's just that simple. So as we think about God and the way that he works with nations, for him, it's no different than us dividing bread. You get a loaf of bread, and you got 3-4 people to feed, and you just pull out a knife, go, okay, you get a slice, and 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 then we're all done. No big deal. You don't think twice about that sort of division because it's easy for you. It's that way with God and kingdoms. It's just easy for him. It's hard for us, right? Very difficult for us To us, it's well beyond our capability, but for him, it's well within. Daniel gives that interpretation. Belshazzar does then give orders to clothe Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and make him the third ruler in the kingdom. And then verse 30, that same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. And so then Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. So what we look at is that Daniel was used to be the proclaimer of the end of that era. And when God says it's over, it's over. And we need to remember that, right? God's in charge of things. And there will come a day when God will say it's over for everything, right? We have a judgment day coming when all this stuff gets folded up. And when he decides that day is, guess what? Guess how much say you're going to have on what day he picks? None, right? So all you can do is just be ready. Anybody have any comments or questions before we close down here this evening? Okay, Bill, do you mind